I want to welcome Gerry Griffin, former director of NASA's Johnson Space Center and legendary flight controller and mission control. He was the lead flight director of Apollo 12, Apollo 15, and Apollo 17, and his team played a critical role in the safe return of the astronauts of Apollo 13. Gerry Griffin, it's an honor to have you with us, and thanks so much for joining.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Really appreciate it. It's an understatement to say that there's so much we can learn from your experiences on Apollo 13 and other missions. But I'd like to start this conversation at the beginning. Could you tell us about your love for space and how you got involved in space exploration?
Yeah, I had graduated from college, Texas A&M, and with an aero degree, an aeronautical engineering, because there was no aerospace. It's 1956. And I had to go into the military. I had a commitment as a flying guy and went into the Air Force. And it was before the space business had really gotten started. And while I was in a fighter squadron, Sputnik flew. And I could tell almost from the beginning that I had this pull to get into the space business, because immediately the country responded with the Mercury project, and NASA was formed in '58. I was still in that same fighter squadron. And it took me a while to get there. I actually tried, had started Mercury when I could get out of the service. And I started about that time, but it took a while to make things work. So I actually joined in 1964. I really wanted to get to the manned, now called better human spaceflight environment. And it took me a while to get there. I joined NASA in 1964, and I got in right at the beginning of the Gemini program. Right at, Mercury had ended. And I went straight into the control center. And I was there for the next 9.5 years. It was the best. Particularly being a flight director, I was named a flight director in 1968 before we flew the first crewed flight after the fire, and I was able to be a flight director from 1968 till the end of the program, and so I got to play on all of those missions. And as you said, I was a lead flight director on 3 of them. It was the best job I've ever had in my life. Now, later I went on to do things at higher levels, but being a flight director in mission control was it. It was as close as I was going to get to be an astronaut, and I figured you couldn't get any better than that. So it was a thrill. It was an honor to serve. We were all a bunch of very young people. I joined. And I had served that time in the military. I'd been in the military 4 years. I was 29 when I joined. When I was named to be a flight director, I was 33. And I was one of the older guys in the room. We had guys in there 20 years old, in their 20s. And that was one of our great strengths, is the young, vibrant, let's get it done. It's never been done before. Let's go do it. And that's what I try to pass along now to the kids that I talk to a bunch, that, you never know what's going to happen. Be ready. Be ready with STEM or STEAM backgrounds. And so that you can take that opportunity like I did to pivot in my career. I would have probably stayed in the Air Force had it not been for the space program. And I pivoted and went into, and it was the best decision I ever made. So all you kids out there, be ready.
Great advice. Be ready, especially now. So that's great advice for the kids out there. Looking back into those days when you entered the space program, when you came in the early 60s and 64, and then became a flight director in 68, you're probably thinking on some early lessons that you'd learned from your teachers and mentors. Could you talk about some of your early teachers and mentors that might stick out, and maybe some lessons that you kept in mind when you went through this really crazy, incredible creation of what is now a legendary system?
You know, if I can remember teachers clear back to middle school for sure. And I remember one high school teacher I had and she was my favorite. Her name was Garrett, and Catherine Garrett, and she didn't teach a technology course. She taught American history. And she infused in us things I can still remember today about what we did that was right, some of the things we did that were wrong in our history, but always that keep pushing the frontier, push the frontier. That's how we opened the American West. And it was not easy. And she talked a lot about the hardness of it. And I remember I have used that as analogy because it was the same thing trying to push the frontier of space. And we've just begun, really. I mean, the moon is so close to us. We haven't really, we're going to send humans to deep space someday.
Mm-hmm.
Even that at Mars will be a small step in the big picture. So I think Catherine Garrett instilled in me early on is keep looking ahead, push for the future, improve it. And that carried over to me. In college, I remember a number of professors. Most of them were aeronautical engineering professors that gave me the grounding, the technical grounding to go on. And one of the things that was interesting is that, we didn't have any aerospace curriculum. It was all aeronautical engineering. So when I first got into the space program, I didn't know what an orbit was. I didn't know how did you put something in orbit and get it to stay there. And that was true of a lot of us in that early going. But it shows you what education will do. We knew critical thinking. We knew how to solve problems. That was really what we were after. And trying to learn about space trajectories and what they were and all that kind of fell in naturally. And thank goodness we had some physics majors with us in mission control, and we had some astronomers, and they knew something about how orbit, and mathematicians that knew how orbits worked and how you had to maneuver in order to change them and things like that. But again, those of us that had not had that kind of background picked it up pretty fast. And I think it was because of our preparation in the basics and the art of critical thinking and problem solving. And that's what I like to see today with the kids when they have a chance to, and younger people all the way from elementary school through college, when given a challenge and say, what can you do to solve it? Most of them are pretty good at it. And particularly those that have had a little science or math or something in their background. So I think that all helped us, and the education piece of it was critical. But it's funny, we didn't get educated to go into space. We got educated to think, and to think in critical terms of analysis and so forth. So I'm glad I had that grounding, because it would have been impossible without it.
It's a fascinating point to think of, not knowing how to go to space, but knowing how to think and how to problem solve and think critically, all the way from those early years with the be ready note. It was Mrs. Garrett, is that right?
Yes.
That shared that with you? Okay. So thinking of that through line with the be ready and preparing to think critically and solve problems, and I want to get into leadership lessons in a second. How do you know what problems to even prepare for? Do you have to invent potential problems in that situation, in that room, and then think of how to solve those? How do you even know what's going to happen?
Well, I think in terms of when you first get into this business, the business of space, I think it's more You don't know what problems you're going to face, and you kind of have to just be prepared for anything. Now, and this was the strength of the Apollo program. And when I say Apollo, I include Mercury and Gemini in there because they were just pieces leading up. The whole thing was really trying to get a man on the moon, as Kennedy laid out the goal. And all of that was kind of in that same package. Once we had a mission and we knew what we were going to try to do, then the problems become more definable. And one of the strengths of the Apollo program was the simulation, the training that we went through, repetitive. And I'm always amazed at how incredibly efficient the technology, the simulation technology was for the mid-60s when we started. Very high fidelity simulations. And it took a lot of work and it was very arduous to set it up and all that. But we would run days of simulation. We would run days that were nothing other than launches. And the simulation guys could put faults in that we weren't expecting, but of course we had thought about. And they would check us to see how we handled it. And we would just do that repetitive over and over and over till it became kind of like clockwork. And it became a little bit of a game almost with the simulation guys because they could be diabolical. They could sneak up on you, throw you something in an era that, and it looked just like a flight to us. We would be in mission control. There would be, the astronauts would be in a simulator. We were separated in two separate buildings, but we were connected with data, and it looked just like a real flight to us in the control center. And so it got to be a game where they would see if they could catch us, and sometimes they did. But it was a great learning experience, and that training, that repetitive training over and over, we would take maybe in a week. I bet we would run a lunar landing simulation. We could run 20 of them in a week. After every one, we debriefed with the crew, with every person in mission control on the same comm loop. We would debrief what we did right, what we saw, and then simulation guys would step in and say, okay, you did that one okay, but you missed this. And you could have done that way and it would have been a lot easier. So anyway, that training was absolutely invaluable. And they're still doing it today. They're doing it in the International Space Station. They did it all through shuttle. And it's one of the keys. So I think anybody interested in getting into space should be ready to, sometimes you have to stand out on the end of the diving board all by yourself and make a decision. There's nobody to help you. And that is the kind of people that do well in the space business. They're not afraid. They don't want to make a mistake, but they're not afraid, particularly in the training phase. Do what they think is right and then see if it is and test it. And so I think it all goes back to what we kind of started with on the critical thinking and problem solving. And that's the challenge. It was fun. I can tell you every minute I spent in the control center, even when we had problems, and you get nervous and, try to figure it out, like lightning hit us on Apollo 12 and I was in the flight director seat. But even when it was all over, you say, boy, we did it. We handled it, got it okay. And we didn't do that every time, but it was absolutely enjoyable.
Well, thanks for bringing that up. I was going to ask you about the lightning strike with Apollo 12, which is certainly such a direct metaphor, for business leaders and people working in any company, the metaphorical lightning strikes that you weren't expecting, and what do you do? When that happens, when you're launching Apollo 12 and lightning strikes, what goes through your head and what happens in the room, and how did you ultimately solve that problem?
Well, the lightning strike on 12 was a really big issue. I thought we might have to abort. And this is interesting because my first thought was, we didn't know what it was. We didn't know it was a lightning strike. We just lost all the data, and Pete Conrad, the commander, started reading off caution and warning signals that he had on a display, and it was clear that the electrical system had been pretty well compromised. And my first thought was, we may have this could be serious, but we had a plot, and this is again came back to that training, the simulation. We had a plot on the big board that sit down in the front of the room of the ascent trajectory. You can think of it that way. First thing I looked at is all the engines were still burning, and we were right on the trajectory. So my first thought, don't do anything too fast. You got time here. Yeah, let's see what we got. And I asked the fellow that handled it's called ECOM, but he handled the electrical system. What do you see? And of course, he didn't see much of anything. But John Aaron, physics major from a small school in Oklahoma. I think he was 23 or 24. He said, tell him that SCE to aux, which has become kind of famous now. SCE to auxiliary, signal conditioning equipment to auxiliary. That's what the switch actually handled. After we finally figured out what that switch was, which I had never heard of because we never had used it in a simulation, they went to the auxiliary position and we got the data back, and we could see that the fuel cells that provided power to the systems had been knocked offline had been like a relay getting tripped, or your circuit breaker in your house, and a lightning strike had blown or popped and had to be reset. And as soon as they reset it, we were back in business. So a lot of problems that happen in space are much slower than that. They creep up on you a little bit. Oxygen tank explosion on 13 was very rapid and had to be dealt with in a hurry. But we didn't have too many of those sudden things like that. But we had a lot of things that every flight had problems, issues that we had to deal with. And some we could handle pretty easily, and others we would wrestle with almost the entire flight. But they were more nagging and caused us to do things a little differently than we'd like to do. But 12 and the 13, I can remember Apollo 14, I was on duty when we were going to land on the moon, and we had the solder ball that shorted a switch, the abort switch. So we couldn't land with that switch shorted. And we finally figured out what to do to solve it, but it took us an extra rev or two. And we finally got it solved and got them down on the ground, and everything worked just fine. But those kind of problems are why we were there, why mission control was there, why the astronauts were trained as well as they were. My good friend Fred Hayes on Apollo 13 just did a fantastic job of analyzing the lunar module systems on the way home. And of course, we had computers and people and all that. And tell the truth, I think Fred had it figured out about as well as we did. How much consumables, the quantities were left, and so forth. And but the astronauts were extremely well trained. And then when we integrated that with mission control, it made a heck of a team. It was an incredible team.
Well, so much of what you're sharing, and these are amazing stories, and thank you so much for sharing. There's a thread around be ready, focusing on the team, an immense amount of preparation and critical thinking. In today's environment, when people in companies in their everyday lives, everybody now is flying without a script, so to speak, flying without a flight plan. What are some key pieces of advice you would have for people looking to manage change, be more agile, think on their feet, work in team environments from what you've called over, decades of this expertise, working in mission control?
Yeah, I really think that another secret to Apollo was our leadership. And I'm talking about leaders above me and leaders of other groups below me. Let me explain what I mean by that. And I think it makes a difference when you get into off-normal situations like we're in now. Leadership, we trusted up and down the line. The people above us in Washington and the program office people trusted mission control, trusted the astronaut. We trusted the guys below us, like SCE dogs. I didn't question that. I knew John Aaron, and I trusted him when he said it, let's do it. And that trust went up and down the line. And we defined levels of responsibility at each level, and we didn't cross them very much. In fact, if anything in Apollo, we tended to shove decisions down to the most capable people that had to make that decision. There's a tendency as organizations grow older, and we're seeing it in this country now, for decisions, particularly when things don't go quite right, pull them up to higher levels, as if a higher level had more capability to determine the right course of action. In Apollo, we went the other way. We left it, if we had a subsystem manager, say on the batteries, subsystem, just the battery, we wanted that person to make the key input, not somebody that knew something about a battery that lived inside the Beltway in Washington. And we kept those levels pretty well determined, and without a bunch of crossing across. Before I left NASA, I could sense that decisions were being pulled up to a higher level than they were early on. And I think it's a natural tendency. Corporations do it as they get older. Somebody says, oh, that's such an important decision. We better pull that one up to headquarters. And it doesn't get any better. I mean, the decisions don't get any better, but you've taken the person that really knows the business out of the loop. If you fast forward now to 2020, and we've got this rather unique situation going on in our country and around the world with the pandemic, I think it's really important. You got to have strong leadership that knows what they can do, and then put the responsibility for those that below them know what they can do, and let them do it, and let them do it, and let them do it, and let them do it. And I think it's a mistake to try to pull too many of those tougher decisions up the ladder. And of course, in a political environment, that always becomes, I'm not arguing politics here, I'm just saying, in a country where you have strong political differences, the politicians always, no matter which side, always want to say, well, we did it, or I did it, or the White House did it, or the Congress did it, or something. And in Apollo, we didn't care. We just wanted the right decision. We didn't care who made it. And I think that's important, an important thing to remember. Let me give you one quick story. I don't know whether you have time to work this in, but let me give you one quick story. Apollo 13. We had decided that they were on the way to the moon. Oxygen tank exploded. They were about 40 or 50,000 miles still headed for the moon. So after some initial kind of getting things stabilized, it became fairly clear that we were not going to land. We weren't going to go in an orbit around the moon. We were going to go around it and come around and head back to Earth. There were several options that we had to do that, and several different ways to do it. And Glenn Lunny's team, the black team, and my team, the gold team, were the two teams that did most of the, taking about a day, did most of the analysis, and then we came up with these options that we could do. It came time to make a decision, and Glenn and I were told to go up. We had a meeting room. Actually, we went up to the viewing room on the control center on another floor, and there was the face of NASA we were looking at. these two young guys, both of us I was 34, I think, and Glenn was 31 or 2. And we were looking into the head of the agency. I think Von Braun was there, I can't remember, Chris Kraft, all kinds of leaders from George Lowe, program manager, and others. And here are the two young guys. So we briefed them on the options and said, the one we favor is we call PC +2, paracynthian, which is the point of closest approach as you go around the back of the moon, +2, which meant we were going to make a maneuver 2 hours after passing that point to speed us up, get us back to Earth. And so we went through all these options. And then we said, okay, and we think PC +2 is best. And so he said, any comments or anything? In today's environment, I think you would have had several people holding it. Well, did you think of this? And did you think of that? And why didn't you think of this? And why did you like this over that? There was a long silence. Nobody said anything. And finally, the head of the agency, Tom Paine, the NASA administrator, said, what can we do to help you? That was all. We said, we think we got it, sir. And he said, okay, let's go. So we back to the floor of the control center, and the rest is history. It worked. My point is that nobody tried to, they knew we were in the best position to analyze all of that. And they could listen to us, and they trusted us. And that story drove home to me what good leadership really is. Listen, but don't try to decide things you are not expert in. Just don't go there. Trust the people. Build your team.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Listen, build your team.
Be ready.
Trust. Be ready. Get out of the way.
Yeah, get out of the way and let them do it.
In some cases, and let them do it. That's exactly right.
Now,
that's a fascinating story.
One other point on that I'll throw in, or as an added thought. The people today at NASA, they're contractor people. They're just as good as we were. All they need to be done is give a mission, a goal, give them the resources to do it. We had those resources. And then get out of the way and watch them. They will do it. They'll do it very, very well. Now, those people are going to get older, and they're going to wind up like me, not in the program. So we got to have some more young people coming behind them that are going to be the same way. And that's why we need to keep the whole idea of STEM education, keep it coming, because we're going to need that workforce. Really, as we take those longer steps into deep space, we're going to need even more than what we have today.
It's so true. And, based on that, that transition to teaching and mentoring and empowering future explorers through STEM and STEAM education, I want to talk about the Cosmosphere, because the Cosmosphere very kindly introduced us. The Cosmosphere is why we're here. I was wondering if you could share your relationship with the Cosmosphere, and maybe a reason or two why you're passionate about the institution, and also the importance, I think, of legacy and continuing to plan for future generations, and why that's so critical now more than ever.
Well, Cosmosphere to me it's one of the favorite places I go, and it's not real easy to get to Hutchinson sometime in Kansas, but that's okay. That's okay. I don't care whether it's winter, summer, or whatever. From the first time I went there, I could tell there was something special when I walked in. It was an environment. It was also the people that I met there, and they've changed over the years. But the character and the way they do business at the Cosmosphere has not changed. It's very friendly, open, and Midwestern, if you will. And every time I walk in there, I feel kind of like I'm back home, almost like being in the control center. Uh, it it's comfortable and it feels right. Besides, every time I walk into the hall there and particularly walk through the whole history passage and all of that, going all the way back to when, not all the way back, very little before I got there. Most of it was in my lifetime. And so every time I walk back in there, and then I wind up at the command module on 13, I feel like, golly, what a life and what an experience. And to relive it the way it's been done there is excellent. And then I get out and see airplanes and SR-71s and all of that. It just all comes together, and talk with the people. The other thing a lot of people probably don't know is the terrific capability you have to restore space artifacts there. Particularly, very important to the restoration of mission control in Houston, because all of those consoles were reworked at the Cosmosphere. Turned out beautifully. I mean, they matched everything just like it was. When I walked into the restored mission control the first time in Houston, I walked in and it felt just like nothing's changed. It's like it was when we walked out of there on Apollo 17 that day. Gene Kranz told me that when he walked in, first thing he did, and he said he hardly thought about it, he took off his coat and hung it up on the coat rack that they had there where we always hung our jackets, the sports coat. And he said he hung it up for you and really thought about it. And so that tells you what restoration can do, and particularly from a historical standpoint and a teaching standpoint. And the Cosmosphere does that better than anybody. I think they can do that in a way that is very, very, very unique. And then I'll finally come back to where I mentioned earlier, the people. The people at the Cosmosphere are dedicated. You can tell, I've been to places all over the world, really, and all over the U.S. extensively, but even overseas. There's something about that feeling that you get that the people are really interested in. You see all the kids coming in, and there's something that is different. And I love it. I love that atmosphere. And so every time the Cosmosphere calls, I respond. I just can't say no. And I've not figured it out yet.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. It's such a great description of the Cosmosphere, that when you go there, you really do feel like you're walking into your own home. And
Yeah.
it does feel, it's so friendly. It's obviously in the middle of the Midwest, but having gone there as a camper and then working there in summers as a counselor, you just never want to leave. You just want to kind of keep hanging out there.
Yeah.
And then the more you go into a wormhole about this subject or that subject and meet other people who are curious and experts in these categories, it's just so much fun. And you just keep learning more.
Yeah. And it's, it is off the beaten track. I like that. Not in the middle of a big city that you got to contend with. It's a great place to go to learn and reminisce for us that lived a lot of that. It's a great place to go.
I couldn't agree more. And looking into one more question as we kind of conclude our time together. It's such an honor to get to chat with you, Gerry.
Yeah.
We talked about be ready, critical thinking, the importance of planning. For folks out there who are watching this on Sunday or on YouTube later on, what's your advice for young people looking to get into space exploration, to do what they love, to follow their passions? What should they be thinking and what should they be doing?
I think probably the most important thing for young people to think about is that there is a lot of aura and glamour to space travel and space exploration and that kind of thing. And some of that, I think some kids, young people in general, think, oh, it's too complicated for me to do. You know, it's just, you know, it's something I couldn't do. Well, they're wrong. Space travel, space exploration really comes back to a nuts and bolts and software and programs, and it's not something that's mysterious. It's different because the environment is different, but nobody should be afraid to, if they even have an inkling that they think they've got an interest in space, they ought to go for it. And if it turns out that it's not your cup of tea, you can always pivot to science or pure science or something over here. Go do something in the weather business or go open a drugstore. I mean, it's not. I think one of the things that kids sometimes try to do, and it was probably more true in my generation than it is now, is they were trying to decide what they were going to do in their final career too early. And I know I didn't wind up where I thought. Of course, there wasn't even a space program when I got out of college. So stay flexible. And the other thing is one thing and some people will disagree with me on this, but one of the things I learned is if you get an opportunity to do something and it's a little different, maybe in the same field like I did, move. Be willing to move. At the end of Apollo, I was getting ready to do shuttle or Skylab, actually. As I was getting ready, I was going to be a flight director for Skylab. And I got a call that they wanted me to come to Washington, long story short, but to run legislative affairs for the agency. And what? I'm an aero engineer. I know, I'm in a control center. But George Lowe and Jim Fletcher and even Chris Kraft felt like they needed somebody in Washington running the legislative affairs side of the House that understood something about the technology that could explain it to the Congress, because we were trying to get the shuttle. Well, I thought, here I am. I was by that time 38 years old. And should I do that? Step out of line here. And I said, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. So I went to Washington for 4 years and saw how the sausage was made. And it was the education of Gerry Griffin. Well, doing that, eventually it set me up to go do other things with NASA at other centers first. And then I came back to Johnson to be the director when Kraft decided to retire. And had I not taken that step, I probably wouldn't have wound up being the director of the Johnson Space Center. It broke me out of the pack, kind of made me different. And I knew the Congress, and I knew these other senators. And so advice to the young people, don't be too rigid. Be ready to move if the call comes and you feel like it's something that you might do and could do it well. I don't know anything about it, but I bet I can do it. That was kind of the way I approached legislative affairs, and it worked.
Thank you so much for that. Gerry Griffin, one of the true legends of space exploration. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.